Every large organization is going to have a cloud strategy. Where does Immuta fit in?
So the reason most large organizations are moving towards cloud platforms is a desire to innovate around their data. They want to make better use of it, and they want to bring in new data into that environment to make better decisions. But to do that, what you need to do as an organization is start to break down the silos around the data that you already have. As you're bringing it into the cloud, it'll inherit all those rules around it and controls that limit how much that data can be shared. And ultimately, to make more use of data, you want to make it more available to more people. That could be internal or external. And to do that, you've got to break down those silo walls. And breaking down those silo walls requires you to bring in a better system of control, a new system of control that allows you to open up this concept of sharing the data to allow more insights to be drawn and more value to be gained. And that's where we fit in. We're that plane for control, automating access.
Keith, from GlobalLogic's perspective, how do you complement and work with companies such as Immuta?
Well, like as Tim said, companies when they move to cloud are really looking for a lot of flexibility across the spectrum, and being able to securely and efficiently share access to data across that organization is absolutely critical to their transformation programs.
When you look from a product capabilities perspective, what type of offerings are you helping customers with to improve their journey?
So there's a number of different areas that we sort of impact within that sort of that journey for a customer. But I'd say the main change is really this philosophical change as they move from what most organizations will have today, which is described as a role-based access control model, or RBAC is the acronym. And that basically means that you've got your data sets over here, you've got your users over here, and then you define these roles in the middle, and you subscribe users to roles, and each role has a view of data attached to it, and you end up with this kind of spaghetti monster of entitlements to give that data access. And this is a massive, massive burden. It's two things for an organization. It's a burden and it's a risk. The burden is in managing who has access to all these different roles, and somebody has to go in and make those changes and create new definitions. And then with all those manual steps, that's where the risk comes in, because all those manual steps, it's very easy for them to not be fully completed or not completed in a timely fashion. And when that's the case, of course, you're potentially leaving open views of data to people who should not see it. And whether they have a malign intent or not, that can open up regulatory consequence for the organization. So it's a massive, massive problem when you end up with this. And most large organizations will have more roles than users, and it's a real burden. And the best impact we've seen with one of our customers was a long-standing Snowflake customer, and then now a long-standing Immuta customer, and they implemented Immuta to help solve this problem. And the first subscription policy, so the way we do it is by policy, first policy they implemented reduced the number of roles by 94%, just like that. And that straight away freed up 2 full-time heads who were doing that entitlement management, to allow them to redeploy to the innovation, the data platforming that was actually real value add for their business. So that's the kind of sort of the impact we're having.
Keith, when you hear Tim share that example, you could ultimately see how that person was freed up to do higher quality work and be more effective within an organization. Yeah. Can you share some other examples that come to mind?
Well, I think the central management of this stuff, and certainly the automation that can be built in around handling access to data, and also privacy controls, is important, not just from an organizational risk and but also from an engineering perspective. It's great to be able to not have to engineer this stuff and create the spaghetti monster that and maintain it going forward that Tim's mentioned. But users get quicker access to data, you get more consistent handling of privacy and access across the organization, regardless of the access platform. Yeah. And you reduce the risk overall.
What do customers need to be mindful for, particularly with blind spots that they may not be aware of on their cloud strategy?
Blind spots and risks. So I think really the awareness that data management doesn't have to be the way it is today is really the blind spot most organizations have, because it's almost like when data platforms were changing from relational to non-relational, people just expected a relational model for data structures. And it's the same with access management today. People just expect a role-based model. That's just the way it has been for 40 years or more. And that model doesn't scale. That's proven and shown. And just accepting that that's the way it is the risk for organizations, because that leaves open these gaps around the timely or effective implementation of change that leave data available that should not be available to people it should not be available to.
Keith, what are the considerations that customers need to take in when they're actually making this strategy, when they're looking to do cloud adoption?
I think, as Tim said, there's a realization that these things certainly too long have been left as either an architectural discipline or as engineering rigor, and actually deserve to be something that's dealt with in their own right. So it's really positive that components are appearing in the market and people are looking at building up a centralized solution for this, because that's exactly what it deserves, and that's exactly what they need.
If companies are hesitant or haven't necessarily made the move and taken into consideration so many things are happening in the world today, what advice would you offer them?
Certainly assess where you are, assess where you want to be, and whether or not what you're currently building today in the old way of doing things is sustainable in the long term, because this is a very long journey and we're only really at the start of it. In 3, 4, 5 years time, that spaghetti monster will be, absolutely enormous, and the amount of resources that you have to put into it to maintaining it going forward will probably be unsustainable.
From a bigger picture perspective, Tim, we're going in with a strategy for what we know and future, as much as we can perceive for the future. How important is it to have that bigger picture, holistic view when you're actually adopting this strategy and putting it into practice?
You do have to have a sense of direction, I think, and so you've got to have a vision of change, and typically that's what a cloud strategy for an organization is. They're looking to make some fundamental changes about use of data for their organization. And when you're changing something as fundamental as your data platform and landscape, then you have to look at changing the whole stack around that at the same time, and the philosophy of those. And I think one of the emerging philosophies at the moment that has a lot of attention or discussion is like data mesh, for example, which is sort of concept of decentralizing data environments. And you can't even approach concepts like that, practically speaking, without automation around access management, because it just is, it's like taking that spaghetti monster and then amplifying it. It's a near impossibility. So practically you see it very quickly in those sorts of environments, but that comes from having an ambition to say, we want to go data mesh, for example. And most organizations should be driven by some guiding philosophy to drive this change. What is it they're trying to do? Is it implement a data marketplace internally so that they are essentially selling internally data products in some way, or is it just breaking down silos across geographies within a global organization, but in a way that is still compliant with all the different data regulations in those different territories? All of these are the kinds of guiding principles that often are driving these data renovations.
So you've given access keys. How do we audit this? How do we actually check to see what you've given them access to, the intention is in line for what we actually did?
Yeah, so the big advantage of centralizing those kind of functions is not only that you can manage access and privacy controls in one place, but it's also that all the traffic or all the activity can be monitored in that same place too. And that goes for not just keeping an eye on what people are doing, but also alerts around activities that might be construed as suspicious or worrying.
Yeah, I mean, one of the curiosities, I suppose, about the area we cover, this data security piece, is it often falls between the gaps almost politically within organizations. So governance teams won't necessarily have responsibility for it, but the CISO function won't necessarily have responsibility for it either, because they'll be looking more at external threat detection and that kind of endpoint guarding. And what we bring in then is this ability for both of those organizations to have a role and be an enabler for good practice in the business and security of the business around how that data is controlled, and be able to see how it's being controlled and who is looking at what, and also go as far as behavioral analysis. Are there data sets that are being used more than you might expect, and is that because there's actually PII data, for example, in that data set that was not originally caught? And then it gives you an opportunity to actually review and change the categorization of data so it can then be put into the appropriate policies.
Tim, Keith, thank you very much.
Our pleasure. Thanks. You.
It's understandable that everybody is excited by this new technology, and no organization wants to be left behind.
With my clients, we're typically focused on time to insight, and trying to work on metrics where we can assess how quickly the teams that need to get access to data can do.
How do we use tools to be able to take the best of those to both build, train and deploy the models?
Organizations who start with the technology first without a business goal in mind or a data culture in place will be bound to failure more than the ones who have put a data culture in place.
It is no longer controllable, predictable, or sometimes even accurate.